Welcome. This is our first unit in child psychology and child development. This is going to be, and I apologize right up front, this might be one of the more drier of the recorded lectures here because we're going to just try to lay out the ground, provide some definitions and some frameworks to understand a lot of the theories that are going to come later during this course. So I'm going to say, I apologize that this is going to be a lot of definitions and not really a lot of, let's say, content in terms of this is how children develop it, this is what's happening inside their mind. But I think that this will help us down the road if we set some frameworks, provide some definitions and some ways to kind of approach the overall topic. So let's start with an agenda for today. Our agenda, the first thing, as I said, is we're going to provide some basic definitions framework, and particularly we're going to talk about 4 domains of child development: physical development, intellectual development, social development, and emotional development. Now, these are not always clear-cut in reality, but I think this is a good way to organize information that we can talk about these separately. We can kind of isolate physical development from, let's say, social emotional development and talk about it independently of each other. And we're going to lay out some other terminology that we'll be using throughout this course. The second thing is we're going to kind of get our first cut at what I might call the nature versus nurture debate, and heredity versus the environment. And so the idea that development is shaped by 2 things. One is your genetic endowment, and the second thing is your physical and social environment around you. And this often is portrayed as a debate, which means it's either or. And what I'm going to hopefully that, at least suggest at the beginning in this lecture is that it might be more useful to think of heredity and environment, that these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, that these are things you don't have to choose one or the other, but that there's recent research that suggests that there's interesting ways in which they're interrelated, which means your genetics is partially determined on things in terms of your environment, and also that your environment is based on things that that genetics are part of the environment. And this field of this kind of combination is sometimes referred to as epigenetics, and we'll get into more detail later in this video lecture. And lastly, we're going to talk about just concepts, hypotheses, and theories. People kind of throw these words around. Sometimes everyone thinks that everything is a theory, meaning that, I have a theory of this and theory of that, and they associate theories with different researchers and names in the field. And they basically, it kind of becomes an appeal to authority, like so-and-so who's famous and has a degree and teaches at a famous college, has a theory about things happen. And we don't always get into what was the basis for their conclusions and why are they describing child psychology or child development in a certain way. And I think it's useful to talk about how concepts interrelate with hypotheses, and hypotheses compose theories. And we're going to do this illustrating this with something we're going to see many times. And if you go on psychology, you will not be able to avoid this, but what's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So without further ado, let's jump into the material. So first, we're going to start with several definitions, and the first one is development, and we're going to define development as a process through which babies become adults, which means that development is, they start at, let's say, a small stage, and that there's going to be a process by which they go from their original stage as infants and to, let's say, their through childhood, through adulthood. And development is this process. Now, sometimes people will take development and distinguish between development and growth. That growth is a quantitative process, meaning that you can measure growth like the weight of a child or the height of the child, and you can track, let's say, that that quantitative change over time. So you see this very often with pediatricians, that one of the first things they'll do is they'll take the weight of a child, they'll measure the size, the circumference of their head, they'll look at the height of the child, and they'll use that to track the growth, meaning the quantitative change. Sometimes development is about a qualitative change, which means that it can't be just measured in terms of, let's say, a heavier child or a longer child or an IQ score, that there's qualitative stages. So sometimes when we talk about development, we're talking about that there's quite a difference between an infant and a toddler and a preschooler and a preschooler and an elementary age child. And the point is that it doesn't necessarily switch on and off at really clear, distinct points in time. But the point is that if you take a child and you don't see them for a while, and then you see them after a few months, it's like a completely different child. And so development is about these qualitative changes that might occur along the path. So the field of child development is a scientific study of the development process of children, which means going from conception, including, let's say, before birth, all the different things that how children develop physically, intellectually, socially, and emotionally, from roughly, as I said, before birth and conception. And it's not really clear generally we kind of distinguish between child and adolescent psychology. And adolescent psychology usually, I would say, is the end of elementary school, beginning of middle school. And that's not really a clear dividing line, but I think that we can treat like adolescents as proto-adults, while before that time, we can talk of them as small children in terms of their independence and in terms of their self-concept. And so I think it's useful to separate adolescent psychology from child development. So we're going to mostly look at this in terms of 4 domains. And we're going to separate them now, and we're going to treat them like they don't interact with each other and they're independent of each other. But in reality, these things interact with each other all the time. And we'll probably sometimes refer, even though I'm saying there are 4 domains, we're often going to talk about them as if there's only 3. We're probably going to lump social and emotional development together, but I'll distinguish what they are differently. So physical development is relatively easy to understand. These are things such as the growth in terms of like height and weight. It is a little bit about your control of your body, so particularly muscle development and motor skills. And that's what we might talk about, the physical development. And there's certain clear changes that will occur throughout a child's life in the physical realm. Intellectual development is more about, let's say, how children are thinking. So what is going on inside their brain, and in a sense, like how are they thinking? A key thing in intellectual development is the development of language, particularly at the early ages. So how they progress from simple words to learning grammars and sentences, and how that process develops. So intellectual development is more about cognitively what are children able to do as far as their thinking, and the sophistication and the complexity of that thinking. Third, we have social development, and social development is more about how they interact with other people. Do they develop empathy? Do they kind of respond to other humans in their environment, whether it's parents or teachers or other children? So this might be studied by like how they play with other children, which means do they mostly, let's say, work by themselves, or do they are more social and extroverted or introverted? And some, even the sense of, are they even aware that other people exist? Most small children, they see as the social world as an extension of themselves, that in the sense that they have this idea that they actually control their peers and their parents, that it's just an extension of, in the same way that I might, let's say my brain controls my hand, they might think that their thoughts control their parents, and there's just different ways of, let's say, treating like other humans as tools to accomplish certain ends. And as children develop, you'll see that they become more aware that people are different than them, that they have different senses, and that often the development of empathy, that, I can identify with how you're feeling, and have kind of an other perspective. And lastly, emotional development. And emotional development is more about self-regulation, their ability to identify their own emotions and feelings, and also be able to control those emotions and feelings in a social setting, which means that we might have a lot of strong feelings, anger, sadness, depression, joy, and how you regulate those so that you can interact with others. So first of all, it's identifying your emotions and regulating your own emotions. But then another part of this is how your ability to identify and interact with the emotions of other people. So let's talk a little bit more about these. So as I said, under the area of physical development, we have things like bodily growth and maturation. So we have everything from height, weight, muscle control. Some of this might be, for example, if we were going to go into adolescent years, the development of secondary sex characteristics. Secondly, and more important, is muscular development. And we'll talk a little bit that there does seem to be a pattern of like what muscles develop before others. So with a small child, that their torso muscles are going to develop well before their limbs. And so what's going to happen is that you'll see small children and they'll be flailing a lot because they'll have gross motor control but not fine motor control. So one thing that very often is done with children is like the food that you feed them becomes things that are larger, things that they can handle, and then things that are, let's say, smaller. So one thing, there's a change of what they might call finger food, and finger food is our smaller things that they'll be able to pick up. And before a certain stage, children won't be able to pick it up. And when they're given finger food, it's not really just about nutrition. What a lot of it is about is their ability to manipulate and pick up the food. And so what you're doing, you don't really care if they don't eat all their food. You might give them, let's say, milk or formula or other things at that stage, but the act of picking up the food and being able to put it in their mouth versus like just grasping the food and smashing it into their face is an important stage of development, and it has to do with going from gross to fine motor controls. And I apologize, I think I have a typo here where the P is out, but I'll fix that before I put the PowerPoint up. And lastly, it's coordinating your senses with your motor control, which means that sometimes our senses are not coordinated. So the point is that what we see, i.e., that taking us that our sense of sight, our sense of touch is coordinated with our motor controls. Sometimes what happens is that our movements of our bodies are not coordinated, so we crash into things. Children often don't have brakes, so they run into walls when they're playing in the gym. You'll see them not be so much aware of things in their environment, so you'll see particularly a lot of bumps and bruises in small children. And these are not because they're injured, and they're not because they're being mistreated necessarily. But happens is when they crawl or when they get up, they don't really have a sense of sense of gravity. They don't really have a sense of spatial relationships, and that becomes more coordinated over time. Secondly, an intellectual domain, which is how children learn, which means it's not just like, do they know things and what are they learning? So are they learning to read? Are they learning to speak? Are they learning to play a sport? We're also interested in how children learn. Do they learn through games and interactions with other people? Do they learn through visual information? Do they learn through, in a sense, listening? And so a lot of this is that, with language, there are different ideas about how children pick up the language. Some people think that it has to do with listening to language in their environment. So if children are in an environment where they hear a lot of words, and particularly more sophisticated words, their ability that's how they pick up the language. Later on, children will not depend so much on listening. They might they'll learn more in their language in terms of reading text on a page rather than in a sense listening to things in their overall environment. One thing that happens with children is that when they're born, they hear everything, and that's one reason why it's almost like a cacophony of sounds. There's too much that they hear everything. And what happens, and you see this, is that people learn to edit out background noise. So the point is you're not even aware of the background sounds. And this is something I became more aware of when I record, let's say, these lectures, because I don't hear, for example, things in the background because, hey, that's my normal environment, and and then when I listen to it, I realize that, there's some background noise. There might be some, the air conditioner, crickets chirping outside and things of that sort. And that's because what your brain learns to do is to edit out some of this background noise and attend to only sounds that are, let's say, meaningful, meaning sounds that we ignore things like babbling and we attend to things that sound like words, even when those are not words in our own language. And a big part of intellectual development is going to be language development, both spoken language and then also written language, and then later on, and reading as well. And so there are a lot of theories about, one thing about humans is that we develop language and many other animals really do not. I think that there's some difference that maybe animals communicate in different ways or through different means, and that some primates and some other higher animals do have something that we might call words, but among humans, language is almost universal. And so it happens even when people are not taught formally a language in a school setting, or they're not, let's say, taught a language like you learn a foreign language in high school. And so there are a lot of speculations about what is going on and what will promote language, and particularly when you have developmental delays, which means children do not develop language as quickly according to their age norms. And this is, I think, a fascinating area, and one that's still that people don't fully understand. But they have an idea, but people still, small children still struggle with the development of language. The other two domains, social and emotional, and I think as we describe these later in the course, we're going to kind of conflate these together. We're going to treat social and emotional as one domain, but I think it's important to distinguish them, make a distinction here between them. That social is mostly talking about how they're interacting with others and their sense of self, their self-concept with relation to others. Like what role do they play in their social environment, and how do they interact with other individuals in their environment. Um, Another big thing on social development is the development of morality. Um, is their morality rule-based? Is the morality instrumental, which means that if I get away with something, does it mean it wasn't wrong? And then what often we talk about character education and character development. So that a lot of these things is that morality and character development really only matter insofar as people are involved in social environments, and that if you are living by yourself, morality and your character probably are irrelevant, because no matter what they are, they're not really having an impact on anyone else. And so a lot of this is learned through interaction with other individuals, whether they be authority figures and adults and parents, or their peers. Um, Emotional development is more about dealing with these strong feelings, and feelings that are not necessarily reducible to like rational motivations. So very often what small children have trouble with is identifying their feeling. Like they're angry, they're throwing a tantrum, but they don't know why they're throwing a tantrum. They're like, I just don't feel great today. And adults struggle with this in terms of like, we're willing to give you what you want to get you to stop crying or end your tantrum, but we don't know why you're feeling this way. Are you hungry? Are you soiled? Are you uncomfortable? Do you have a rash that's making it itchy? So the point is there's a process of identifying where your emotions are coming from, understanding your emotions, and learning to regulate them, particularly strong emotions like anger, fear, joy, and some of these might, if they're not developed, might become phobias that are affect you, but in ways that you are not able to control or not able to regulate in a way that regulate effectively, and as a result they become like stumbling blocks later in life. The other part of the emotional life is being able to identify and understand the feelings of others. So very often when we talk about someone who's a sociopath, one of the key features of that is that these people do not seem to understand how their actions impact on others, which means when they hurt other people, they don't seem to understand it. They see that they kind of are disconnected from it. They can't identify that. And you see this sometimes in what you might say for people who are on the autism spectrum, is that they don't pick up on body language, and they don't pick up on the expressed emotions of other people. And so they might lack affect, or they might lack an ability to empathize, or at least not, they don't empathize maybe perhaps in the same manner that other people that we consider normal. And so this is something that develops, and sometimes various children struggle with it. So the point is they might understand their own emotions, and they might not understand other emotions. Let me just stop and pause here, just give one example of this, because having spent time in Japan and growing up and developing inside the United States, one thing that's always struck me is that Japanese are really good at empathy and really bad at sometimes understanding their own feelings and emotions. So if you ask a Japanese student in a classroom about what other people in the classroom need, they will talk about, oh, this person is anxious, and this person wants praise, and this person needs this type of help, and they'll be able to go through what everyone wants in the room. And part of this is because in Japan there is kind of a process of socializing into being aware about other people and being part of a larger group, and finding your role in that group, and then supporting other people in your in-group. In contrast, Americans very often are oblivious to other people's feelings, and there are, a phrase that's often used is like the ugly American, that most other people, when Americans go abroad, see us as being very loud, as very pushy, as very insensitive, and lacking kind of sometimes social graces. However, Americans are real. Just go back to the Japanese example. If you ask a Japanese student, like, what do you want? They'll kind of almost feel anxious, like, I don't know what I want. Am I supposed to want anything? Is that they're not really good at understanding their interpersonal emotions, or they bracket them out because they say, well, these will just get in the way of being part of a larger group. Now, in contrast, Americans are very attuned to, let's say, their own emotions, what they want, what their goals are, and being able to articulate them. but are probably worse off culturally than maybe like working in larger groups and getting their own personal goals to be in harmony with the groups that they belong to. So another big concept here is what we're going to call the individual life cycle, so that we're going to create these different stages. And as we present the material in child psychology and child development, we're basically going to go on these stages, although these are not necessarily sharp cut points, even though we're giving it, let's say, time references like 1 month versus 1 to 12 months and 1 to 3 years. But this is just so that when we use these terms, we're not using them loosely. So when I talk about an infant, I'm talking about a child of a particular age. If I'm talking about a toddler, I'm not describing, let's say, how they move, i.e. that they toddle, but that it's a particular age-like range. And what we're talking about are the things, the developmental milestones that occur during these different stages. So briefly, you have prenatal, which is just conception to the time of your birth, and it is not 9 months for all children, but let's say this, standard. It's not even really measured in months; it's measured in weeks, often these days. But from conception to 9 months, we can talk about prenatal development and what happens in the womb prior to the event of birth. Secondly, we can talk neonatal, and you often hear neonatal like a NICU, a neonatal intensive care unit. Neonatal just refers to the first month of life, and in this first month of life, children are very, very dependent. They really don't have the ability to move on their own. They don't have the ability to sense their environment. They're probably more fragile. So in that very first month, you might see a lot more, let's say, TLC being provided to a child, and a lot more attending to every single need. In some ways, it's quite different than even just infancy, which is really kind of a similar stage. That first month. So let me just give you one example of this from my own experience as a parent. So when a child is born, you take their weight. They're born and they're like 7 pounds, 8 pounds, 9 pounds. What often happens in the first month is that children will lose some of their birth weight, which means if they're 9 pounds, they will go down to 8 pounds. And in the first month, then they will regain that weight, which is kind of not how you think about it. You think children are constantly growing so that they start with a certain weight and they just go up from there. But what happens very often is that when they're in their prenatal state in the womb, they're getting constant nutrition. And in that first month, they're learning to get nutrition outside the womb, which is a different process. So you'll see, like, for example, a lot of breastfeeding coaches who will help new mothers, learn to feed their child. A child has to learn to kind of latch on. And this it's not as, let's say, straightforward. And that's something that we might talk about, like neonatal, that first month, and then making sure they get, nutrition. But another thing about it is, and this goes back to the formula versus breast milk kind of debate, which is the idea that breast milk might convey certain immunities because the breast milk contains some of the antibodies from the mother, and that might be an advantage. And that's because a child is born without any type of immunities. You'll see the child perhaps be more fragile during that first month and even later in that first year. So I'm sorry, moving on, infancy, generally from the end of the first month to 1 year old. You'll see a lot of physical development. So in the first year, you'll see the height and weight double and triple. So for example, if a child is born around 10 pounds, by the end of the first year, they'll be about 30 pounds. And if they are born roughly about, let's say, 20 inches long, they'll be about 30 inches long by the end of the first year. And after that first year, they don't grow as fast. You'll kind of see a slowing of, let's say, both the accumulation of weight and height until later stages. Toddler generally means the beginning of walking, and that generally comes somewhere 9 to 12 months. You'll see them taking their first steps and moving independently. And obviously, this means that they have a lot more motor control. They're a little more coordinated. They might start, creeping and crawling first, and then being able to stand up, and then being able to walk on their own, and then maybe perhaps handle stairs and climbing up onto things. And this is going to happen in that first 1 to 3 years. Preschool, basically, this is the period before they enter, let's say, formal education. You're going to see a lot more physical development being important in this. You're going to see the development of spoken language. And then lastly, elementary school, which is elementary school kids. You're going to see a little more social development at this stage being really, really important. And toward the end of it, you're going to see a little more intellectual development, meaning that you're able to handle and learn new material on your own. So let's talk about the nature versus nurture debate. And so there's two kind of ways to describe this. One is nature versus nurture, which is kind of a common sense. Maybe a more technical way to describe it is heredity versus the environment. Heredity are these traits that are passed from your blood relatives, as we understand by DNA through genes, which are held on your chromosomes. And this is referred to nature because it's considered your inborn or your natural, let's say, endowment or abilities. And that these are mostly genetic. And if you're familiar, if you've taken biology and you've learned a little bit about evolution and the genetic basis of some of your traits, you know that these are passed from parents to children across generations. Particularly in this day and age, I mean, people are more and more likely to give genetic explanations for aspects of child development. I think this is partly that we mapped the human genome in the 1990s. As a result, we have things like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, and people are very interested in finding out their genetic traits and finding out where they came from. Because it's, let's say, in the environment and in the milieu, and people can talk about it, people are more fascinated with genetics, but they're also more, what often comes with like I'm going to say, an interest in genetics is also an interest in evolution, and particularly social evolution, social Darwinism. And I think that, you know, when I was younger, people were less concerned about, let's say, their blood identity, meaning like, you know, where they're from and what race or ethnic group they belong to. And one of the, I think, dark sides about this is that racism ebbs and flows, and I think with the more emphasis people put on genetics, there's a lot more an idea of competition in social evolution or social Darwinism, but also the idea that people are ascribing traits to racial and ethnic groups. And I think this has become really, there isn't that much basis on it, but it is something that really since the mid-1990s you've seen grown. And in the 90s, there was a book called The Bell Curve that basically said, well, certain racial groups are intellectually superior or inferior to other groups. It was widely rejected and panned, and the evidence really was never there. But I think that's when people emphasize heredity, that there's a potential to go down that kind of hole and put an overemphasis on having good genes, and, you know, saying, well, my parents, some people are some way and other people are other ways because of their genetics, and then that cannot be changed. And as a result, we shouldn't help people as much who perhaps have a poor genetic background. And, you know, I'm saying it with like, the heredity is something, but I think that it's also kind of a dangerous road, and I just want to caution about that because we'll talk about it later, and we'll talk about, well, such and such genetic thing leads to certain types of outcomes, and I don't want it to be interpreted in that way. The second kind of part to this is the environment, and these are the conditions and situations that surround and affect you, and a lot of these are big thing that we'll talk about is parenting, that there's a lot of theories about different styles of parenting lead to different types of children in terms of, let's say, the traits that develop, and let's say certain characteristics and how they interact with others, and particularly with social and emotional development. Things in the the social environment seem to develop certain types of, let's say, individual characteristics in those domains. And also things in your physical environment, particularly like chemicals in your environment, or things, the stability or chaos in your physical environment can affect, let's say, development of certain physical traits. So if there's a lot of disruption, if there's a lot of noise in your environment, one thing I found is that people, this is a pop observation. This is not based necessarily on research, but what you'll see is that people who grow up in loud environments, which means people who grow up in cities where, you know, there's noise 24 hours a day, people are up all the time, there's a lot of background noise. will be more likely to tune people out because a lot of things is background noise, and they won't necessarily pay attention in the same way where let's say it's a quieter overall environment because there's not as much, let's say, filtering that they have to do. And I find that people who are from cities and suburbs, which are a little bit noisier than the countryside, as adults seem to be, it maybe sometimes filter noise differently. And then as a teacher, I see this sometimes in the classroom where some people can work really well in a loud kind of environment. They're not as shy. They're kind of able to kind of negotiate and talk over people, or not really. And there's other people who, like, if someone else is talking, they really have trouble listening and following, which means that if there are multiple people talking, they can only follow one conversation at a time. And I think that that might have something to do with the environment, and we can talk about that more over the course of the course. One thing here is just want to point out in the lower right-hand corner, Noam Chomsky is a famous linguist, and he was known for a theory that language is inborn, which is that children are hardwired to pick up language, and that if you look across the world, that all languages have a similar syntax and grammar underneath them, and which means that there must be something in children that allow them to organize spoken and written language, and they have a natural, let's say, ability or inclination to do that. Another perspective on this is that language is nurture, which means that you pick up language by being in an environment. So one example of this is that generally what you see with first children, like the eldest child, is that they're a little bit slower sometimes in language development because they don't have other children in their environment. And as a result, that they sometimes have developmental delays in developing spoken language relative to their younger siblings. So even though usually oldest children are, let's say, more academically ambitious because generally they got a lot more attention from their parents, one other thing is that they tend to be sometimes a little bit slower and a little bit more reserved in terms of using language and being kind of extroverted. While you see very often with youngest children is that they're very comfortable, they're generally more extroverted, and it's more likely sometimes to see that younger children become class clowns or more outgoing and extroverted. And there might be something about language development that has to do with, let's say, their environment, and might be more about nurture. So just to go a little bit deeper here and just give you some things about heredity, there are about 23,000 genes that babies inherit from their parents on their chromosomes. Some of the genes are basically sections of DNA, which means they are organizations of DNA, and this was sometimes referred to as your structural genome, which means these are kind of, let's say, traits that you inherit and create kind of the basis and structure for development of traits that are observed, whether they're physical traits or whether they're social traits. And genetics is a study of passing these traits across generations. So for example, when you say something has a genetic basis, you're basically saying that this is an inherited trait from parents, parents who inherited from grandparents, and tracing, let's say, the distribution of genes across generations. And so you might track a gene, for example, eye color or height or hair color, and that you have dominant recessive traits, and why you might got one trait and your sibling got a different trait even though you had the same parents. And genetics is this study of this. In the environment, and I want to think that there are many, environment is a broad term, and I think we might want to distinguish between the physical environment, which means things that are actually inanimate objects around you, versus the social environment, which involves the human societies that we all develop in. And the basic idea of an environmental approach is that your surroundings determine the nature of your development. So in your physical environment, it can be things like chemicals in your environment, so particularly toxic chemicals that might inhibit or lead to the manifestation of certain genetic traits and not others. Another big part of the physical environment is diet, which means that some people, the level of your nutrition might lead to the manifestation of certain physical traits and not others. And lastly, hazards in your environment. So it could be everything from danger, it can be noise. Children who grow up, let's say, in chaotic environments, like places where there's ongoing civil war, or places where there's a lot of stress, or for example, that they might experience um, like weather events and things of that sort. For example, scholars have been able to identify the lack of learning that occurs to children when they miss, let's say, a week or 2 weeks of school because of a hurricane or a major snowstorm. So, for example, about 10 years ago, we had Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Irene that closed school for 2 weeks in this area. They will probably be able to detect in the next 10 to 15 years that these children will have actually missed, there will be a kind of a regression because they missed more school than, let's say, children in other years that weren't as many interruptions. And the pandemic, I'm sure we're going to see a change in development. We're going to see kind of an impact of the development because of the pandemic and because of the suspension of structured education and things of that sort. And I have observed this, and several other people have observed this in small children, which is that because many of them have been isolated from their social peers, particularly children who are at the stage where they're developing language, you're seeing a regression, which means their vocabulary is becoming more limited. And these are just, as I say, these are just kind of off-the-cuff observations. These are not things that have been established yet, but it will not surprise me that what you'll see is kind of a comparison where you'll see that these children will have maybe a slightly delayed language development or a slightly delayed intellectual development. Not that they won't get there eventually, but they might get there a little slower than, let's say, a cohort of children who did not have, let's say, the pandemic or a major hurricane that interrupted their education. And literally, you can measure the impact of education down to days that you spend in school. So you're able to measure, let's say, by your absences. Just like your absences, we can make a prediction about your future earnings after you graduate from school. And that means that things about your environment that seem relatively minor can actually be measured in the aggregate for groups of people. The second thing is a social environment, and this can have, you have different, concentric circles in your social environment. At the most basic level, it's your family and parenting. And one is, just kind of the style of parenting that your parents adopt. But another part of it is where you fall in the birth order. Like older children might have a different experience than younger children versus middle children in the family. So, for example, one thing that's often remarked on is that middle children generally have fewer pictures in family albums because they're not the first and they're not the last, and very often they feel a little bit ignored. Oldest children feel a lot of pressure because generally they're held to be more responsible, sometimes asked to take care of their younger siblings. And so the point is that it is part of your environment and can lead to a different developmental process, even though a lot of other things in the environment are similar. There is a larger culture. We can see differences between how childhood develops in different cultures. How children are raised in East Asia is very different than how they're raised in the West, and even within East Asia and within, let's say, Western Europe and the United States, not to mention Latin America and Africa. There are different styles of child rearing and different languages that they learn in culture. And there have been studies, for example, by looking at like children's stories that are taught in different cultures. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later when we get into the social development and the impact of culture, is that children learn different lessons about individuality, about politeness, about social expectations. And these don't come directly from the parents, but they might be in the larger culture and things that are reinforced. And lastly, in the modern world, school is one of the environments that has a huge impact upon children's development. And it can be things about the quality of teachers, the quality of education, the type of peers, the opportunities provided by the school, and these can also impact child's development. But I said I don't want to emphasize this idea of nature versus nurture. I also want to look at that sometimes nature and nurture are working together. And this is usually called, and there's a video on the Google Classroom about your epigenome or epigenetics. And this is the idea that there's some interaction between your heredity, your genetic basis, and also the environment that you're raised in. So for example, that there might be a gene for height. A height tends to be dominant, which means that if you have one side of your family is tall and the other one is short, you will likely be taller. So over time, people are getting taller and taller. And this becomes clear if you live in an older house, which means a house in the 1700s or early 1800s. One thing you'll notice is that the ceilings are much lower. And that's because overall people were shorter 100, 200 years ago. And as height as height is as height over time, the dominant trait for height, as people have good nutrition, what you've seen is they've gone taller over time. And so the average height for a man in the 1700s was something in the mid five, I think it's 5'6", 5'7". Now the average height is 5'10", 6 feet. And that's really with the same group, the same population, but just that over time people are getting taller. Now, what they also notice is that height is a really good measure, though, like, for example, the level of diet. When you have a malnourished society, what you often see is sometimes a decrease in the average height for the overall society. This happened in the United States in the late 1800s because a lot of famines and crop failures and several large depressions between the 1870s and 1890s. You actually saw the average height drop. And usually that's a big warning sign. And I'll give you just one other example of that. You used to be able to predict life expectancy by the month that you were born in, which means children born in the spring had a very different life expectancy than the fall, and in the southern hemisphere it was reversed. And the reason for this is that when we live in an agricultural society, you generally had a lot of food around harvest time, and during the spring, during the early planting season, there was a lot less food because you had eaten up your stores over the winter. And as a result, two things. First of all, mothers were relatively malnourished at certain times of the year. As a result of in their neonatal development, this impacted them because they were getting less food and not necessarily the right level of nutrition, but also that young children, there was not enough food around, and so there was a little bit of a starvation, and as a result, in the large numbers of the overall society, what you could see is that the children born at certain times of the year had a lower life expectancy. Now that we live in a modern world with globalization and we're able to get food, more or less your grocery stores is stocking, if you're in the United States, is stocking the same food year round. You don't see this month being able to predict your life expectancy in the same way that it would easily have been able to do 100 to 200 years ago. And this indicates that without proper diet, you might have a trait for height, but it won't be realized if your diet is not adequate. Also, I should say, in addition to diet, sleep is important. You might get potential inheritance from your parents. Like if you have two smart parents, a lot of people say, well, your children are going to be smart too because you're inheriting those traits. But I can tell you that smart parents sometimes have dumb children, and dumb parents sometimes have very smart children. So it's not a one-to-one relationship. And what happens very often is, like, just because you have some, as a teacher, you often run into students who are very naturally intelligent, but are not necessarily very hardworking. And what you'll see is you have other students who are very hardworking who may not have the same talents or gifts. And very often what you'll see is that some students will get the maximum of their potential, while some other students will only get a percentage of their potential because they're not working at it. And I think this is true of everything from, like, academic intelligence, but also in terms of, let's say, talent in terms of sports or things of that sort. Some people are naturally gifted at certain sports, and some people work really hard. And if you are on a sports team, you probably realize that the ones who train, the ones who practice more, will probably pass people with just natural talent alone. And lastly, that sometimes your social emotional traits are inherited, which means you might have a trait or a tendency toward addiction. You might have a trait where you have a tendency toward anger, but you can, let's say, regulate this trait by choices that you make and experiences. So, for example, you might have, some people might have alcoholism in their family, or some people have addictive personalities. But what might happen is that if they witness addictive personalities in their parents or in their family, they might take steps early on to avoid things or avoid situations that might lead to, let's say, the negative consequences of certain social emotional traits. So this epigenome is basically that people who have studied the DNA and genes, is that there are chemicals that can turn on and turn off genes, and these are related to things in your environment, which mean so basically experiences you have, the level of parenting might, like, act as switches that either activate or deactivate genes, which means you have genes, but some of them might be latent, which means they might be inactive until they're activated by something in your environment. And so the point is that when you experience some things, your body chemistry might change. This body chemistry will then activate these genes, and these genes will become, let's say, will actually impact you and develop, while certain genes that are not activated will not manifest themselves. So one way to think about this is in terms of necessary versus sufficient conditions. Genes might be a necessary condition, which means if you don't have certain genes, you might not develop. For example, if you don't have a gene for blue eyes in your family on either side, you're not going to develop blue eyes. But what might happen is that having that gene, let's say, in your library, there might be then secondary things that are able to activate that. So the point is that a gene might need necessary to develop a certain trait, but just having the gene is not sufficient, which means it doesn't necessarily mean the trait will develop. The trait will develop if other conditions in the environment are favorable to that, and that genetic endowment will then be activated. So there's another thing about epigenetics and I'm just going to focus on the negative ones and things that are called stressors, things in your environment such as anxiety, stress, poor diet, chemicals in your physical environment that might act as negative genetic switches, which means that these can activate recessive or harmful genetic traits, and they wouldn't if they were in, let's say, in a different, let's say, physical or social environment. So some general principles about growth and development that I think that are important, and these are just kind of like general like approaches to looking at the process of growth and development in children. The first one is that growth and development are constant, that if you are tall, like for example, if you have one physical trait at one stage, that is likely to carry over to other stages, which means if you are a tall child, you are likely to be a tall adult. If you are a short child, you are likely to be a short adult. If you are maybe an emotional child at one stage, some of those emotional traits are going to carry over, which means that it's not like going to jump around. You can kind of get a sense of someone's disposition. So if you have a child who's fussy or a child who is not fussy, a child who's basically chill versus a child that's easily excitable, you generally will see these traits later in life. They might not be as extreme or acute, but the point is that these traits will still kind of be there. The second principle is that growth and development is gradual and continuous, which means that it's not like little steps. It's kind of like a little bit ongoing development, and it's gradual, which means that you kind of go it little by little by little. So when you watch a child beginning to walk, is that you'll start to see, first of all, you'll see them move their body. They won't be moving at all. Very often, in my experience, children will learn to crawl backwards before they learn to crawl forwards, for a variety of different reasons, partly because of how their weight is distributed through their body, meaning their head versus their lower body. And then you'll see them creep, and then I see them pull themselves up like on a small table or a chair. Then you'll see them walk, but they'll have to hold on to something like a railing, and they'll kind of like go from, they'll cruise, they'll go from, let's say, one object to another and using that object to kind of act as a walker. And then you'll see them take a few steps and maybe fall, and then they'll try it again, and they'll get a little stronger. And so the point is that this is a gradual process, but it's also continuously happening. It's not like they're 100% walking or they're 100% crawling. Even when they start to walk, you'll see them sometimes crawl in certain situations. And so the point is that you'll see it over a long period of time, but you might not see these changes on a day-to-day or even an hour-to-hour basis. The third principle is that it's sequential, which means that there are predictable stages or milestones. They don't necessarily happen exactly on a particular day or a particular week, but they tend to happen in the same order, which means that you crawl before you walk, right? You crawl before you creep before you walk, and means that these are, one leads to another. And you can think of these in terms of building blocks, and that you have to accomplish one stage or achieve one milestone before you move on to another. So in terms of language development, what you'll see first of all is babbling, which, first of all, you'll see, just vowel sounds. So you'll hear like and then you'll see babbling, which means they'll combine a consonant and a vowel. So ba, 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 da, 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 ma, ma, ma. And then you'll see them kind of trill on it and repeat that. And then you'll see something like they'll have nonsense words where they'll talk to themselves, and then you'll see them achieving something like adult spoken word communication. That there are differential rates, that not everyone goes through the sequences at the same speed, which means that everyone is on the same road going in the same direction, However, the speed at which they're going toward the same destination is different. And so we have norms, which means ranges that children develop certain traits. And when they don't achieve those norms, we might talk about developmental delays, and you might see some children will develop language later, some children will walk earlier. But the point is that you shouldn't necessarily get worried about this, because it isn't a natural thing that children will develop certain things before others, and you might even see a little backsliding before they move ahead again. So the point is about that even though they're going in the same sequence and it's continuous and there's constant growth, what you might see is that different speed for different children, even children in the same family. And the final is things that the different domains that we talked about earlier are interrelated, which means physical development affects intellectual development. And one thing that I experienced in my own child is that children develop teeth in different ways, and this can actually affect the development of language, because as your mouth fills in with teeth, your ability to recreate certain sounds is changing. And what that means is that, like, if they're teething a lot or they're developing teeth early, their oral cavity is shaped differently, and their ability to like copy and mimic, by looking at the how your mouth and teeth move in other people, because it's changing for them, their ability to recreate the sound can be affected. And so depending on, let's say, whatever their physical development in terms of teeth can affect their intellectual development in terms of development of spoken language. And same thing intellectually, that sometimes things that they understand in their minds can affect things like their ability to walk or coordinate actions between their senses and their motor development. So one thing, and we're going to go through is, and this is once again another kind of like setting the table, the relationship between concepts, hypotheses, and theories. And I find that people use these terms really loosely, and they often say, well, so-and-so's theory of something. And mostly what they're saying is so-and-so believed that this is the way things worked, and we don't always understand like what was the basis for their belief, that as if like these are all a bunch of opinions of different scholars and they're all equally good, and we lose the ability to evaluate these different approaches or these different research on these questions. So I'm going to start from kind of the most simple building blocks to kind of the bigger picture when we talk about theories and paradigms and hypotheses, because most people also talk about things as true and false. And very often that is not the best way to evaluate these different things. So you can have a theory that is factually wrong, but still useful. And so most theories are simplifications of the world. They are not really great for describing individual persons, but they might be good as a broad way of talking about things. So we often generalize and speak in generalities and acknowledge that there are exceptions to that. But the point about this is not necessarily about true and false. Sometimes it's about useful or not useful, and sometimes is what I might call it's fruitful or not fruitful. Sometimes you can have a theory that's wrong, but it helps you ask good questions. So in my psychology class, I'm talking about some of the incorrect ideas that people have had over time about how people think. And even though we're pretty sure that they're wrong, it's still helpful to review their ideas to understand why they were wrong, but also what were their reasons for believing a certain thing about the world. Anyway, so let's start at the most basic level. And I think the thing is that first of all, you have concepts, and these are sometimes, terminologies. And a concept is a category for organizing information. And if you can measure it, and it has a range of values, sometimes a concept is interchangeable with something we might call a variable. So the point is that the variable has different levels, and depending on the level of the variable, we can make predictions about its relationship to other concepts. So a concept is mostly about, it's not true or false. A concept is whether it's useful to organize information in a particular way. And so generally a concept is useful or not useful. It's not necessarily true and false. What can be true and false is a hypothesis, which is on a relationship between two concepts. Is it a positive relationship, a negative relationship, no relationship? Is it what's called a curvilinear relationship, which means at some levels it increases and at other levels it decreases? And so these are what we can actually test through experiments, and these are what we can test in terms of, let's say, using statistics and other types of mechanisms, which means we can measure two different concepts and we can see if that they have a relationship between them and whether that relationship is positive. What still we might not understand is we can talk about that these might be related, but we might not know if one is causing A is causing B or B is causing A. We might not know about causality. What is causing the other? Which one is the cause and which one's the effect? What we can say is that there seems to be a relationship, and we can describe that relationship using experiments and using statistics. Above hypotheses are theories, and theories are not generally one hypothesis, which means that you can't really prove a theory true and false. So like on a big level, the theory of evolution, there's no one experiment and there's no one study that can either prove evolution true or false. Evolution is a group of related hypotheses, and you might think of them, sometimes the interchangeable word here is model. Theories are models about how the world works, whether it's the psychology of a child, whether it's the path of development, and generally these are simplifications about the messiness of the real world, which means very few people fit neatly into theories and models, but these theories and models are good descriptions about the overall process. So for example, you might not know how an individual cloud is formed, but you can have a theory about how clouds are formed, which means you know that it's about evaporation and then condensation around nuclei, and that creates clouds. So I might not understand, and this is why weather is hard to predict, why a certain cloud will develop in a certain place on a certain day, but I can have a simplified theory about evaporation, condensation, precipitation, about what's happening underneath clouds. And that can help me understand it, even if it's not an accurate description of every single, let's say, observation. Now, above theories, we might have paradigms, and paradigms are usually groups of theories that are consistent with each other. And what a paradigm is saying, it's a perspective on a particular topic that tells you what is most important. So when we talk about nature versus nurture, it's not so much that one is true and the other one is false. It's that for certain applications, we might want to focus on the environment more than we want to focus on the genetics. And in other applications and other topics, we might want to focus on the genetics more than the environment. And what a paradigm says is that in certain things, some things are more important. So look at this first. And when you're approaching something, presume that this is what's most important, and these are the things that you should attend to or pay attention to. And particularly in terms of, if you think of terms of making observations of children or like a medical person diagnosing, they're generally going to look at certain things first and then kind of say, okay, once I've eliminated that explanation and that explanation is not possible, then I can go to, let's say, more and more, let's say, uncommon interpretations of something that I'm observing. So, for example, that when as a teacher, when I'm trying to understand students, I usually have a basic approach to like, what am I trying to understand, why the student is succeeding or not succeeding. So I might look, first of all, that I might have a theory that students who work hard do better, and so I might try to find out like how much effort students are putting into an assignment. So maybe the first question when a student does poorly on a test is, did you study? Because it's not necessarily being judgmental. It's just like, well, if you didn't study, then we have a clear reason why you might not have done well. So let's try first studying and see what happens when you study. And then if that doesn't work, then you say, okay, we can look at something else, like maybe you are a particular type of learner, and therefore you need a certain environment to succeed in. But the point is, like, if you're not putting an effort in, a lot of other things might be true, but the point is that they're not going to be irrelevant. So a paradigm kind of points to you what you should look at first before proceeding on to other explanations. So one common theory is called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I'm not going to completely explain it right now. I'm just going to kind of hand wave at it. You will see this again, I'm sure. Maslow's basic theory was that human beings have certain needs, and it's arranged in a hierarchy, which means you need to satisfy the needs at the bottom of the hierarchy first before you can, let's say, move on and worry or accomplish other things. So they usually start with basic human needs, like physiological needs, like you need to eat, you need shelter, you need water, you need to have sleep. Once you have those, then you focus on safety of your environment. Once you have a safety in your environment, you move on to friendships and social relationships, and so on and so forth, until you get to like self-actualization, like what is the meaning of the universe, I want to do something that doesn't just pay the bills, but something that makes me feel good, something that's challenging to me. And Maslow basically had this idea that if you lower level needs are not satisfied, you won't be able to be effective at satisfying higher level needs. And this has generally been very informative about education because we find when students are hungry or when students are anxious or worried about things in their environment. So for example, if someone in your family is sick or you're having an unstable home situation, you're not going to be able to study and be effective in the school environment because you're going to worry about these more basic needs first, and you're not going to be able to be effective as a learner. And so what you've seen is that schools have become trying to take care of, let's say, these more basic needs. And you can see this in terms of like providing free lunches for children who might be hungry, because if you're hungry, and there's a lot of research on how hunger affects your mental state, and that it makes you tunnel visioned and it makes your attention very narrow, and therefore not very effective for doing anything else, like your performance level. And there's various ways to measure this, seems to go down when people are hungry, and not just because like you're hungry and you get hangry and things of that sort. But another thing about this is just what's most important is that that a lot of attention, particularly in the most recent decades, is focused on the safety of students above and beyond just like say learning in and of itself. And so the pandemic is part of this, is that if you're not in a safe environment and you feel threatened and you feel like, oh my gosh, there's germs everywhere and I'm going to get the virus and there's someone, it's hard to be effective in that situation. And this is why, such care has been taken to like address the pandemic and create a safe environment for students. And I realize it's been very tough for a lot of students, and a lot of students are suffering both mentally and physically because of like what the situation the pandemic is creating. So someone who's looking at Maslow's theory is going to say, look, we need to address these more basic needs first, and then we can move on to, let's say, more complex or higher level needs. Now, let me just say that Maslow's theory there's been really no evidence for it. Maslow is more or less suggesting something. Many people have learned Maslow's hierarchy of needs from a textbook and have never read the actual book he wrote this in. I have. He's more or less kind of like a speculation. I would say that Maslow is a fairly good description of suburban white children in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, and a pretty poor description of children everywhere else in the world, including environment which are very chaotic or disruptive. And also, even I think Maslow's theory does not do as well for current generations as it did for previous generations. That being said, Maslow's theory, I think, is still something you should learn because I think it's still helpful and it kind of is provocative in the sense of what it's suggesting. But if we're going to analyze Maslow's theory in terms of like some of the things that I mentioned before about concepts, hypotheses, theories, and paradigms, is that Maslow has several different concepts embedded in his theory. So first of all, there's a concept of a need, that there are basic needs, so food, clothing, water, and higher level needs like self-actualization. That basically needs are what are the building blocks of, let's say, how people are following their growth path and their development. Another concept is there's a hierarchy, which means that there are basic needs at the bottom that are more essential and need to be addressed first, and there are higher level needs, and that there's a clear arrangement of these needs from bottom to top. And often when you see Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you see it arranged in like kind of a layer cake, a triangle layer cake, with like the basic needs wider at the bottom and the self-actualization needs narrower at the top. It's not clear why that is. Usually when you have a hierarchy, it's because there's fewer people at the top and more at the bottom, but it's not clear that there are more physiological needs than self-actualization needs, whether in terms of the number of individual distinctive needs that are out there, or the number of people who have achieved them. It's possible that it's wider at the top and narrower at the bottom, but I think that this visual cue kind of suggests a hierarchy that there's kind of like a ladder from the bottom to the top, and that the bottom is kind of more of a foundation that supports what's going on at higher levels. Even though it's not necessarily larger, but it creates this idea of a structure and a stability that the bottom parts are holding up the higher parts. There's a hypothesis, which is that Maslow suggests that if your needs are satisfied, or the amount of your needs that are satisfied will predict your level of personal development. If you're having needs that are not satisfied, you are going to achieve a lower level of personal development. And so the theory here, which is a variety of different hypotheses, like will kind of generate predictions, which means individuals who are not satisfying their needs are going to have, let's say, developmental delays, or are going to have blockages or lack of progress, and they're going to be stuck kind of at a lower level of the development, which means that if you are in a society that is deprived of several of your basic needs, most of your daily thoughts are going to be about achieving those basic needs, and you're not going to spend a lot of time with these higher level thoughts. In my psychology class, one thing about this is, and also adolescent psychology, is that in poor communities, you see often less suicide than in more affluent and more educated communities. And part of this is because if you're worried about, let's say, where your next meal is going to come from, you don't have time to be depressed, which means you can't focus on depression or your feelings because you're worried about being hungry. And so that might be a prediction that you can test that comes out of this theory. Another thing that you find, and this comes up in adolescent psychology, is that bullying historically was much more common in affluent and educated and suburban communities than it was, and much more likely to be found among white children than among minority children. And the reason for this was that the social pecking order and kind of a lot of things that go with bullying come out of a kind of a suburban environment where people are more competitive, and environments that are potentially poor, or environments that are kind of have subcultures and might have other supports in them, less bullying occurs. And so some people have suggested, by studying the evolution of bullying over time, is that bullying in minority cultures is something that occurs through their interaction with, let's say, more affluent cultures, which means watching television programs that portray suburban high school students, something that happens perhaps when there's more interaction between two communities that are geographically side by side. As minority communities have become more affluent, they've come to emulate or imitate some of the social dynamics. And so what you used to see is, I mean, it's not that there were not problems, it's just that there were different types of problems. And so Maslow might suggest why this might be is that you don't worry about self-actualization and what other people are saying about you and who your friends are when you're worried about, do I have shelter, water, food? The paradigm that he comes out is very much an environmental paradigm, because Maslow is saying that your environment determines your level of development. Basically, there's nothing genetic in the way that Maslow is explaining your level of personal development. It's all determined by whether your needs are satisfied by things in your environment. It's also is sometimes called the humanistic psychology that Maslow comes out of, which means that the peak of human development is self-actualization, right? That the goal of human development is not just simply to get 3 meals a day or to have access to water and shelter, that humans will eventually try to achieve these higher level needs. Self-actualization, where I come from, what is the meaning of life? And this is a particular perspective because it focuses on the fact that you're trying to reach these peak states or ask these bigger questions. And so Maslow is very much influenced by philosophy and less interested in things like training and behaviorism, where, for example, you might train a dog to have a certain thing. So there's not really a learning process in Maslow as there might be in some other psychological theories. So let me just wrap up here. So I know this was a little bit long. This will in classes will not. This will be divided over several days. But I think that we have certain questions that are suggested, and we have a good framework. And what I want you to focus on is, in your own mind, think about what sounds more convincing to you. Do you think that genetics plays a bigger role in terms of child psychology and child development, or do you think it's more factors in their environment? And just, not necessarily something to share, but just take a look at your own life. Like, why are you the way you are? Do you attribute it to your parenting? Do you attribute to genetics? Like, I know sometimes people feel like physical aspects have affected their psychological development, like whether they have a certain hair color, whether their hair is straight or curly, or whether they're tall or short. There's some people whose personality is very much built around by being a tall person in the room, thin or skinny, people who are short, because being short means that your perspective on the world is shaped by your physical stature. And what are the different weights you would give to those in terms of your own development? And I think that's a good way of looking at this debate. And this debate will come up again and again and again during this course. And so this is a question that we'll come back to, and it might be good just to kind of take some notes on your own development, and perhaps take a look at your siblings, because your siblings are going to share some of your genetic traits, your heredity, but they might be in different environments. So that's all for now. I will see you in class, and I will see you at the next video lecture.